It's my pleasure to introduce you to our host and our moderator and also your host for today. This event is co-sponsored by the Marty Center and the Greenberg Center. At the Marty Center, we believe that understanding religion is crucial to a functional society. Our programs move the expertise and rigorous research of the University of Chicago Divinity School, housed here in Swift Hall, beyond the academy, serving as a bridge between the field of religious studies and the wider public. The Greenberg Center for Jewish Studies was created in 2009 to nurture dialogue among the many disciplines, scholars, and students engaged in Jewish studies at the university. Building on the particularly theoretical and interdisciplinary intellectual culture of UChicago, the center aims to raise questions and catalyze unexplored connections that will reconfigure the boundaries of Jewish studies, both within and beyond the walls of the university. Your moderator for today's panel is Professor Kenneth Moss. Professor Moss is the Harriet and Ulrich E. Meyer Professor of Jewish History, as well as the director of the Greenberg Center for Jewish Studies. He is a historian of Jewish politics, culture, literature, and thought in the modern era. Please join me in welcoming Professor Moss and today's panel.
Well, I'll move very quickly. Wonderfully distinguished panelists and much to say about each. I'll introduce them and then we'll just jump right in. Sandra Fox is the Goldstein-Gorin Visiting Assistant Professor of American Jewish History at New York University and Director of the Archive of the American Jewish Left in the Digital Age. Her research interests include American Jewish history, the history of youth and childhood, Yiddish culture, and the history of sexuality. Her book, The Jews of Summer, Summer Camp, and Jewish Culture in Post-War America from Stanford just a year ago, addresses the place of intergenerational negotiation in the making of American Jewish culture. Next to her sits Bruce D. Haynes, Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Davis, where he holds affiliations in geography, community and human development, religious studies, and Jewish studies. His research interests include segregation, suburbanization, the black middle class, race and racialization, and ethnic community organization. Dr. Haynes has appeared on NPR and PBS numerous times and has written for ESPN and The Forward. His most recent book, The Soul of Judaism, Jews of African Descent in America, from New York University Press in 2018, won the 2019 Albert J. Raboto Book Prize for Best Book in Africana Religions. It is also noted by the Jewish Book Council. Next to Bruce sits Jessica Kurzane, Assistant Instructional Professor in Yiddish in the Department of Germanic Studies. Her work here at the University of Chicago. Her work specializes in questions of race, gender, and regionalism in American Yiddish fiction. She has translated 3 Yiddish novels by Miriam Karpilov, A Provincial Newspaper and Other Stories, Syracuse, 2023, Judith, Verlag Press, 2022, and Diary of a Lonely Girl or the Battle Against Free Love, Syracuse University Press, 2020. Dr. Kurzane's work to translate Yiddish women writers was recently featured in the New York Times. She currently teaches all levels of Yiddish language, as well as courses in Yiddish culture and literature, and it should be said, American Jewish history and culture, and she serves as well as editor-in-chief of Ingeveb, a journal of Yiddish studies. And finally, Achon Chaviv, Ben Sachs is head of scholarship at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies in Baltimore. Ben is a professor, university administrator, scholar, award-winning teacher, public speaker, and practitioner and facilitator of interreligious dialogue. In addition to publishing on topics relating to Jewish philosophy, German Jewish history and culture, Jewish-Christian relations, and interreligious dialogue, Ben has been a discussant on PBS and NPR, a speaker in the United States State Department Speaker Program, most recently at the U.S. Embassy in Copenhagen. He's been an advisor and interviewee for important films by Martin Doblmeier on Heschel, film Spiritual Audacity, Abraham Joshua Heschel's story, and served as a consultant for the film The Sabbath. Ben also is co-chair for the Religion, Holocaust, and Genocide Studies Unit for the American Academy of Religion. His most recent book is entitled Winged Words, Benjamin Rosenzweig and the Life of Quotation, published just this past July in 2023. He's currently at work on 2 new books, Through the Thickets of This Pathless Hour, Interreligious Dialogue for the 21st Century, and Israel, Palestine, and the Fate of Interreligious Dialogue. So please join me in welcoming this extraordinary panel, and we'll get right to it. Okay, so, and we'll begin we'll sort of move like this, and then I'll start with you, Sandy. From your particular perspective, or really any perspective you wish, what do you think people most need to know about American Judaism, American Jewish identity, American Jewry as a community, and about the trajectories and the tensions that characterize any or all of those domains today?
Thank you. Everyone can hear me, right? This is good? Okay. So I think that the thing I've been trying to emphasize in my teaching and in my scholarship is really just the plurality of American Jewish identities and communities and politics. Oftentimes in the American Jewish world, we do talk about it as a unified community, but I think ultimately we know that actually there are many, many different kinds of American Jews, and that what makes the communities so interesting is that it is not a single thing. Often my students come into my classes thinking that because all of the Jews they know might be liberal, or if they grew up Orthodox, they all believe in the same Torah. Someone said that in my class recently, and I just was like, oh, okay. Because, right, so many American Jews are secular, maybe atheists, like, they don't necessarily believe in the Torah at all. They feel that all Jews must be that way. And I don't think my students are so far away from generations that are older. They're being raised in American Jewish communities where they don't necessarily recognize the differences between the communities they are from and other communities around them. So I think that what I try to emphasize is that there are many American Judaisms and many different American Jewish identities today, and also as a historian that there always actually have been. I think also, in broader American society, in popular culture, most Americans see Jews as secular, as white Ashkenazi, usually as coastal, and that these are also really narrow visions of American Jews. So I'm obviously thinking back to something like Seinfeld, where the Jewishness is a point of humor, it's a point of culture, but there's no religiosity. And that's kind of continued in American Jewish popular culture, so that both Jews and also broader Americans are not seeing Judaism through a particularly diverse lens. I think also, as a historian of youth and childhood, one of the main things that I like to talk about when it comes to American Jewish communities and identities really is just the story of generational change that's always happening. It's always recurring. So, as a historian, sometimes I can get, I guess, iffy about talking about the present or the future. Certainly, when people ask me questions about the future, I get really concerned because yeah, well, I know it happens a lot, and that's fine. But I was thinking the other day that actually, in my interest in paying attention to children, teens, and young people, I'm always kind of studying what American Jewish adults are currently nervous about, because they project those concerns onto young people. And what my book on summer camp kind of tracks is the concerns that Jewish adults had in the post-war period about the Jewish future, and how they saw them vis-a-vis young people, and also the changes they couldn't have seen coming. And so I think that's the other main thing I think about when I think about what people need to know about American Judaism and Jewish identity today, is that there's always these changes that are lurking in the younger generation that don't really get taken. They get taken seriously sometimes in the field of Jewish education, but everyone's always caught by surprise. So I think that'll come up in other questions, but I'm thinking a lot about how the generations are so different on huge questions, like religious questions, on political questions, and cultural questions.
Bruce, what people most need to know about American Judaism, American Jews, perhaps about community, although, as we heard, that might not be the right term. So,
thank you for the question. I guess I'll follow up on Sandra's focus on plurality. And I think the first thing to note is the great demographic changes that have gone since 1965 in the Jewish community. There's been a large number of people from the global south, from the Caribbean, from Latin America, from Asia, who have come into the United States. And that has changed the nation, and it's also changed the American Jewish community. Changes in multiracial identity and the way people think about their identities since the 1990s has affected things. Changes in the laws regarding interracial marriages have affected things. The other thing I think is the emphasis on Ashkenazi normativity has kind of come up as a major issue, raised by the presence of so many non-Ashkenaz Jews in America. And with that, there's been a shift in scholarship. I think beginning late 80s and the 90s, we saw new Jews of color, in a sense, making a claim to have a presence in the Jewish community and talking about their invisibility within the community. Since then, we've seen the Jews of Color Initiative come into being. That's one of many, many different organizations that are reflective of non-white Jews organizing amongst themselves to be recognized, to be less invisible, to get federation support and other institutional support. And so the rise of many organizations of Jews of color, the Multiracial Jewish Network, the Alliance of Black Jews, there are at least about a dozen different organizations that cater in different levels, some secular, some Orthodox, to Jews of color. And then on top of that, you have North African and Middle Eastern Jews also beginning to organize around those North African and Middle Eastern identities, separate and overlapping with Jews of color. And so the debates about, well, who's a Jew of color? If you're Latin, does that mean you're a Jew of color? If you're Sephardic, are you a Jew of color? And who is and who isn't, and who shouldn't be counted, and who wants to be counted? And so all of those issues, I think, are going to become very prominent in the future of American Jewry.
Jessica.
It's hard to go after such good answers, and I don't want to be repetitive, but I will make some points about this idea of a kind of fragmented, multiple communities of American Judaism. And I think one thing that's helpful to think about is that indeed it is multiple, and also there are networks that are connected in various ways. And so we can think about American Judaism as having regional variations, but then there's a lot of movement in between the regions, or we can think about it as being quite segmented according to how, levels of observance, but then within those, people come together in political organizing or in cultural affiliation, or in where they eat or what they consume in media and so forth. And so it feels sometimes like there, from certain perspectives, that there's quite a lot of separation in the community. But I do think that there are also there's a lot of movement in between those segments. And I think that a question, a sort of live question for the American Jewish community seems to be, are there ways that this very fragmented community can refer to itself as a community in order to leverage cultural power, political power, or is it too fragmented to do that? So that, I think that's a question that's kind of floating in the air. And then another, we've sort of talked about American Judaism as a kind of a cultural thing, as something related to communities, but I think we also need to think about it as a religion, and what are the ritual changes that we're experiencing, and different ways that people are approaching spirituality, and so that's another kind of I think important lens, and one that's been impacted by liberal Christianity, one that's been impacted also by Eastern spirituality and various kinds of different turns. And I'm not an expert on this, but I feel like that's something that we need to kind of bring into this conversation anyway, although I may not be the right person to ask about it. And then finally, and maybe this is where somewhere that I am a good person to ask about it, is that I think we can also think about American Judaism in terms of language, and that it's a community that it's sort of the histories of immigration, of movement can be traced through the languages that people use here in America, and continue to use in various ways. And Sarah Van Oor has done some interesting research about American Jewish English, and whether there are American Jewish Englishes, which might map onto the various ways in which the community itself is so diverse. And so I think that even just looking at the ways that people express themselves, the stories they use to ground their identity, can be instructive to understanding what American Judaisms are. And to the point about Ashken normativity, I think that story is one area in which the Jewish communities try to build a sense of shared identity through shared stories about the past, and some of those stories can be exclusionary. And so whether or not everyone fits into those stories, they become these kind of overarching sort of packages of messaging about what the Jewish community is. And for that, I'm relying on my good friend Rachel Beth Gross and her book Beyond the Synagogue. So those are different ways to think about what the Jewish community thinks it is, and also the various ways in which individuals may or may not fit into those boundaries.
And finally, Ben. You've got plenty of time to think of a point.
It's okay. The good thing about being last is I can say the least, and we'll see if that works. So I share my colleagues' views about the demographics of Judaism, of Jews, and the multiplicity of Jewish voices. I think something that I would like people to know about American Jews is that there was a Pew Forum in 2020 that interviewed Jews. And while surveys can be inartful in the types of questions that they ask, when you ask a Jewish person, are you religious? That may not actually mean the same thing when you ask a Christian or a Muslim person the same question, because, as you know, religion's bedeviled by definitional ambiguity. But there are some numbers that I'd like to just consider in understanding the plurality of Judaism and Jewish voices. 42% of American Jews responded that they have a non-Jewish spouse. 62% of American Jews say they share their holidays with non-Jews. 12% of American Jews say they attend regular services. And this question was also, I needed to know more. What is regular? I attend regular services, which is like 12 times a year, once a month. Is that every week? But what we're learning is that when we talk about the difference within Jewish community, what we're also seeing is that there are a lot of non-Jewish people in Jewish communities. And so leadership has changed, understandings of Jewish identity have changed, day school movements have changed. Because if you hold on to more traditionalist notions of what it means to be a Jew, the institutions will not last. Another thing that I think is interesting is that Mordechai Kaplan, the founder of the Reconstructionist movement, had mentioned that in terms of Jewish continuity, as long as you make Judaism compelling to Jews who practice it and think about it, you don't have to worry about it continuing. It's not simply about having Jewish babies, but it's about having Jewish ideas, Jewish culture, Jewish religion. And I think the statistics is really interesting in terms of the diversity within Jewish communities, that if almost 2/3 of American Jews are celebrating their holidays with non-Jews, that means the literacy issue with non-Jews is coming down, in the sense that you'll have non-Jews that have Jews in their family. So when you think about things like anti-Semitism and combating anti-Semitism, it becomes a personal issue for many people who are not Jewish, which I think is an important thing to know. The second thing that I would like people to know about American Jews is that most American Jews in this survey, over 80%, believe that anti-Semitism is worse today than it was 5 years ago. And they weren't asking whether or not the views were correct. It was about how they experience the world, how they orient to the world, and their perceptions of the world. I think that's important because there is a generational divide, as we've heard, on the symbolic power of Israel and its relationship to anti-Semitism. And that's playing out in productive and unproductive ways in Jewish settings, especially in the wake of October 7th. So the things that I want you to know, the two things that I want you to walk away with from my view is that Jews are incredibly diverse in ways that 50 years ago we wouldn't have imagined them being diverse. And secondly, anti-Semitism still plays a role in how they identify as Jews. Yeah,
with this next question, and brace yourself, Sandy, because it's going to start in the past, but it's going to end in the future. But you've already, all of you in these really very compelling and beautifully meshing answers have begun to answer this question. I'll only note maybe that The one aspect of the first question that I still want to leave hanging, alongside sort of tropes of diversity and fragmentation and maybe internal tensions that Ben points us to, I don't think anyone really spoke directly to questions of robust tensions in the community, right, and conflicts, and I think that's something we'll want to return to. But I also don't want to put my finger on the scale of the second question, because maybe that's where the second question leads, and maybe not, and you'll decide. And Bruce, I'll start with you, and I'll turn this, of course, to all the panelists. What's changed most dramatically, this is the past, in the last, let's say, 20 years, although maybe we think we should be speaking of the last 6 months. That I leave to you. What are the new phenomena that strike you as most decisive? And it may be that we've sort of begun to answer that part of the question in the first part. And where do you think things are going? What sort of trajectories strike you as particularly important to think about?
Ooh, future's a tough one.
Yeah. You're the
Past is
sociologist.
far
you know,
easier
right?
to talk about. Back when I went to undergraduate, late 70s, early 80s, if you took a course in race in America, you were likely to learn about Jewish Americans, anti-Semitism, and learn terms like assimilation as Jews became more accepted in mainstream America. By the time we get to 1985, Karen Brodkin writes a book about Jews as white people. Just at the moment when that was sort of being declared, American Jews have made it, there's no anti-Semitism, they've passed into white America, suddenly we have the explosion of all these non-Ashkenaz Jews on the scene. And so the issue for me is really now the presence of race coming back into the Jewish community in a very profound way. And I think the old guard is very sensitive to the term, right? Because of Nazi Germany, and race was not a good term for Jews to use. At the same time, there is this contradiction in the history of Jewish America in using sort of self-identification of racial terms like Hebrew as a way to self-identify. And so by the time we get to the 1990s, we have both this decentering of sort of Ashkenazi normativity, we have the presence of the question of, well, are Jews really white people now? And as we move into discussions of social justice and race in the post-George Floyd era, it's raised all sorts of questions about, well, where the Jews fit into the American canon, given the fact that we have Jews dying in synagogues. At the same time, we have Jews who are very successful and made it into mainstream America. And so these contradictions seem to be ever present in conversations about the Jewish community today. And of course, that gets kicked up when we talk about Jews of color feeling sometimes excluded. So for example, many times my first experience in Ashkenazi context, people might say, well, are you Jewish? And how did you come to be Jewish? And that might be offensive to Jews of color because the presumption is, well, you don't look Jewish, right? So this notion of who looks Jewish is really also being decentered. So for me, ironically, it's not really about this question of color and identity, which is what Americans are preoccupied with. You know, are Jews white, and should they think themselves as white or not? I think the bigger question is the question of how race and anti-Semitism are linked in history. And I think the conversations about anti-Semitism often place anti-Semitism outside of the context of historic racism. And I think it's very, very important to understand that the conversation of race that has been going on since the early modern era has always framed Jews outside of the context of whiteness. And it's really only in the post-World War II era and in America specifically, that Jews have been seen as, quote, white people. But once you leave the American context, you might argue that there are two competing narratives. One saying that Jews are Jews and that there's something else other than being white, and the other is that Jews are assimilated and a part of the American mainstream. So for me, it's both these issues of Jewish identity, but also the linking of the challenges that both Jews of color face and Jews face, which is this intersection of anti-Semitism and racism in America.
Thank you. Jessica. Oh, sorry. We're one mic short and at a small table, but we're very glad you're all here.
I think if we're thinking about how things have changed quite recently and how they will change, the importance of online community seems very significant. And what that does to American Judaism, I think, is remains to be seen, but we're already seeing evidence of that. And I think about how in the early 2000s, there were these like sort of early kind of almost gaming websites, virtualshtetl.com or whatever, where you could kind of be in community with one another when you were far away, and that felt really revolutionary and strange and funny. And now I think it is just a fact of life, and I think that is reshaping American Jewish life quite significantly, in particular because I think it used to be a truism that there are various ways in which the Jewish community is fragmented and ways we can categorize them. One is small town Jewish life versus urban Jewish life, and that small town Jewish life is characterized by everyone in the community, whether or not they have similar background or beliefs, kind of have to get together to have a cemetery, right? There are ways, the community has to be somewhat cohesive and it feels somewhat isolated. They don't have access to the same kinds of resources, or when they do, it's because of newspapers. It's something coming in to an otherwise an environment that feels somewhat closed off, although people were of course always traveling and moving around. And I think that has been kind of broken wide open. In my very small corner of Yiddish language learning, I think the pandemic completely transformed the field of Yiddish language learning. And I run this Journal of Yiddish Studies, and before the pandemic, a couple of years before the pandemic, we published an article by a person who was in Omaha, Nebraska, wanted to learn Yiddish, and was frustrated that there were no Yiddish language programs where he was. He was an adult learner, he was not a college student, he couldn't afford to go to a summer program, so he bought himself a book and he was learning on his own. And he wrote an essay about how isolating that experience was and how it felt like he was speaking a language that was not a spoken language because there was no one to speak it to. Fast forward a couple of years later, and that simply is no longer the case, because the majority of the places that you can learn Yiddish are now online, and people are conversing with one another across time zones, people are conversing across generations, and it's creating a whole new and really generative and beautiful community that is not restricted by space. There is a lot to be concerned about the way that everyone's lives are moving online, the role of social media in American Jewish life and in American life and in global life writ large. But I think this other kind of transformative power of making Jewish life more interconnected, which I think also allows for an exploration of diversity for people who weren't aware of various pockets of the Jewish community, to suddenly be in contact and in conversation with one another, and sometimes in pretty strong argument with one another, when maybe those ideas would have been otherwise less accessible.
Ben?
So things that I've noticed that have changed that I think are worth noting are that there is already an aversion to institutions writ large, and that Jewish communities are starting to see that as well. You also see, in terms of the infrastructure that Jewish communities have built over the last 50 years, foundations, charity groups, we're going to see a shift in that leadership as families whose matriarchs and patriarchs are in their 70s are giving their foundations to their children who have different goals and ideas on how that money should be used. So I think one of the issues that we're going to see within Jewish communities is the shift of priorities in what we think we as a broad way is important in Jewish context. The second is leadership. So like Americans overall, American Jews are becoming less religious in a conventional sense, in terms that they don't go to synagogue. And that means the people who run and operate in synagogues, jobs are in jeopardy. And so we're seeing consolidations of rabbinical schools, and then moving online to accommodate bivocational religious leaders that actually fits tropes in both Christian and Muslim communities. And so I think that this is a major change in how Jews live communally and understand their experiences. A third is that the Pew Survey indicated that the two fastest growing groups of young Jewish people are people who are non-denominational, meaning they don't have any orientation to any of the institutional religions, and Orthodox. So it's a pretty wide variety of religious expression. And I think it's important is that while Orthodox usually gets consolidated into this idea of like a capital O Orthodox, Orthodoxy traditionally has been far more diverse than Reform and Conservative Judaism in terms of how they discuss religious law, theology. You can go with a sociologist to Borough Park or Williamsburg, and they'll tell you how a certain kippah, a yarmulke, indicates a certain religious worldview. So that is the third. And then the fourth is something that will be controversial, is that in the 1980s, there was something that most Jews in America could organize around and agree upon, and that was Russian Jewry. That it didn't matter where you came to form your religious expression or your community. This was an essential feature for Jews in the United States. So we don't have that anymore, that people are going to rally unequivocally to one political thing as Jews and seeing that as an expression of their Judaism. I was told that the second largest gathering, and I have no way of verifying this, so maybe I shouldn't share it, but anecdotes can be data too, right? Collective memory. So the historians, you can write it down and tell me whether or not I'm right. That the March for Israel in November was the second largest gathering of American Jews in history. I don't know if that's true. Hyperbole seems to follow these political moments. But I think what was important and a change that most people would have never imagined is that they only had one religious speaker at that event, one person who self-identified religiously, and that was John Hagee. And John Hagee is someone who is a Christian Zionist and is also fond of the theology that Hitler was actually acting as a tool for God in an interpretation of Jeremiah, because most German Jews were not Zionists. And so some really acrobatic biblical exegesis, he comes to that point. He was the religious speaker at that event, which at least for me made me very uncomfortable and I don't know that everybody in the audience was thrilled about it either, but the very fact that someone like that could speak at an event that was organized by American Jews, I think is a really challenging shift in institutional priorities.
So far we have Kaplan and Hagee on the table in our discussion of the religious landscape. It's,
great Jewish thinker, Hagee, right?
Yeah.
Sandy, bring it on home.
Well,
major changes.
This is great because you all thought about major changes that were more recent, whereas as the historian of the post-war era, I'm thinking since the post-war era, which is a long time ago. So the things that came to mind for me were both the growth of Reform Judaism, replacing conservative Judaism as the biggest movement of organized Jewish life in America, which is something that took place over time. But in the immediate post-war decades, the conservative movement was by far the biggest, and now it has flipped, and the conservative movement is really challenged for the future, actually, and it relates to the question of intermarriage in a lot of ways, the ways that the Reform movement has accepted interfaith families, and the conservative movement has struggled to have an opinion about that or take really have a purposeful direction about that. And also the growth of orthodoxy, which Ben pointed out, is huge. A lot of times, I think American Jewish historians have ignored modern orthodoxy as a historical phenomenon, but it's really, really an important part of what's happened in America since the 60s and 70s. And that community is growing and growing. as Ben pointed out, at the same time, the Pew study and other studies will point out that a lot of Jews are Jews of no religion, or nuns, not N-U-N, but N-O-N-E-S. But also, I would say that I think that there is an embrace of religion among young Jews beyond denominationalism, so that at least some part of that, right, like non-denominational category is not people who have no interest in Judaism, but actually are doing it outside of these movements entirely, and that is something to track going forward, especially in that camp of people who might have otherwise been part of the conservative movement. There is a growing world of traditional egalitarian Judaism, particularly in big cities like New York, Boston, Chicago, of young Jews who maybe keep Shabbat and kosher, but they go to independent prayer groups. They don't want to be parts of synagogues. So the numbers on that, I don't have those. I don't know if anyone's actually studying that, but that's where a lot of the young Jews who are part of communal leadership are going, where a lot of rabbis are going. And so even if that's, 2% of American Jewish millennials, I have no idea. They have that creates a lot of power because they're the people that end up being communal leaders. Speaking of communal leadership, I think the growth of women and LGBTQ people in communal leadership, whether that's the rabbinate or otherwise, is tremendous. American Jewish spaces are predominantly female. That's really a demographic reality, and I think that Orthodoxy might be the place where that's different, but still there's conversations about there just being more women than men, and so what does that mean and why is that happening? And then dissent over Israel is much more accepted among American Jews than it's ever been. So if you think about in the 1970s, there was a group called Breira that was really the children of the American Jewish establishment, the kind of people who went to Camp Ramah or were part of youth movements, and who still were actually ultimately very Zionist, but were left-wing and talking about the problems of occupying Palestinians on a permanent basis, basically. And they were vilified, and nowadays there's a lot, even though there's still a lot of vilification of young Jews on the left, I would say it is much more accepted than it was even 10 years ago, that there's going to be this dissent, that it's going to get more complicated. And I think that's because as Israel shifts rightward and ultimately most American Jews remain progressive, that gap becomes harder and harder to kind of deal with and justify. And at the same time, also, these changing demographics post-65, also there's a growing conservative element in the American Jewish community, and it's not enough to create a political shift. I think political scientists have been waiting for this majestic American Jewish realignment to the Republican Party, citing the idea that since Jews are affluent overall, they should also become Republican, and Jews are never really doing it, which I think it's really funny that political scientists boil it down to that. But at the same time, there is a growing Orthodox contingent. Middle Eastern Jews are overall more conservative, the ones who've moved here, from places like Iran, Syria, and other places in the Middle East. Russian Jews also, and Israeli diaspora, like Jews who came from Israel and now live in America. So that is also a huge change and shows that, yes, American Jews are still, broadly speaking, Democrats, but there are elements where, I have students who are Iranian Jews who can't believe that's true because their community is so Republican.
You've all put on the table some really interesting sorts of things that stand in a certain kind of tension, or maybe the point is that that things are so fragmented that the tension's not actually inevitable. One question I have, thinking back to the ways in which you've all pointed to the fact that it's much harder to, for better or for worse, it's much harder to impose defined communal frameworks. Much easier to find a DIY Judaism or Jewish engagement of your own making, and really you can do so with all sorts of new tools and never really have to plug back into that world of the post-war institutions. That was, and of course, in a longer historical perspective, the American Jewish community was notoriously not organized and notoriously divided over quite fundamental questions in the first decades of its sort of the vast expansion of the Jewish community largely through East European Jewish immigration. So the idea that there would be a shared communal structure and a shared ideology is very much is really a post-war phenomenon. It may be gone, it may be done. So I guess I just want to leave that hanging because in some sense the next question is the one that's supposed to point us all toward thinking about intense political conflicts, not just among Jews, but within which Jews, both real and symbolic, are caught up. No one's mentioned the Trump administration or the first round yet, and right, and that seemed there were. I mean, I can still remember when that seemed like it would transform the ways in which the American Jewish community saw itself and was seen, and maybe that's in some sense implicit in some of the comments you made before, Bruce, about the re-entwining of race and anti-Semitism. We've barely, begun to mention questions of Israel that I think are on all of our minds. So with that in mind, let me push you to think a bit about out loud about the conflicts that are most defining and will most define or redefine American Jewish life. And again, those could be conflicts amongst Jews. They could be conflicts in which Jews are willing or unwilling participants. They could be conflicts in which Jews are largely there as a symbolic function for others. And Jessica, I'll begin with you.
Well, I suppose I want to start by thinking about this question about where do religious leaders show up in the political sphere, if not at a rally for Israel. And I think that we're seeing it quite a lot. Actually, I think we're seeing a generation, especially among younger clergy people, of quite politically active clergy people, some of whom, and I think a place that we're seeing their involvement most, at least among liberal Jewish clergy people, is in activism around the issue of reproductive rights. And maybe this also has to do with the large number of people who identify as women who are in positions of power in the Jewish community. And also, I think my sense is that although it's not universal, one sort of political rallying point for the Jewish community is around refugee rights and immigration, and the idea of sort of the Statue of Liberty as a symbol of what it means to be American, and this kind of really compelling narrative, though it doesn't encompass all of the Jewish community, of a history of immigration and a history of refugeedom. And so I think those are places that we are seeing religious leaders in the Jewish community, but not necessarily in a Jewish rally for the Jews in the Soviet Union, but as part of coalitions. So can we look for ways in which the Jewish communal leadership is participating in sort of coalition politics? So that's one, sort of, to answer your question about politics. But you were asking for maybe a more things that are more divisive, but I do think that that some of these things will prove to be divisive because of the bifurcated political atmosphere in America in general, and also within the Jewish community. So I do think, and also around gay rights as well. The question of what the politics of Israel will mean for the American Jewish community today, I think is so fresh and so ongoing that it's very hard to make predictions about what that will mean for the shape of American Jewish life, except to say that it is clear that that it will be profound and transformative. I think there's no way in which the current war will not completely transform American Jewish community and politics, but it's hard to know what that way will be just now.
Maybe you'll tell us.
I don't think I will. No, well, that'll be the second part. So the first part, I want to add on to what Jessica was talking about with the immigration debate, and why I think that is a really important struggle for Jews for all the reasons that Jessica outlined. The Tree of Life shooting was about immigration. The association of Jews with Hias, that they are bringing people from South and Latin America to destroy a country in all of its whiteness and all of its glory, that Jews are using this as a way to undermine the project of America. So Robert, what is his last name?
Yamach Shema, what's the difference?
Yeah, Ivanti. So his whole social media was about how Jews are the children of the devil, and he quotes John. Why I think this is important is that environmentalists and economists are talking about an incredible refugee crisis that we're going to have in the next 20 to 30 years, where you'll have between 1.5 and 2 billion people who are living on land that is not hospitable to human life. And it's a reality, and it's going to create an incredible movement of people to places that are more hospitable to human life. Jews usually have been at the forefront of that kind of organizing in this country. And so they will mine, I assume, the religious resources that have been informing their politics for the last 100 years to rethink what the American context looks like in the wake of an inevitable climate disaster. In terms of the state of Israel, I will say that because 3 days a week I'm not a conventional academic, I work in an academic nonprofit. 3 days a week I'm either in a mosque, synagogue, church, university, community and gathering space, trying to get people not to undo 10 years of community building over this conflict. It is real, it is heavy, and I don't have an answer how to move forward, even though Ken talked about me writing a book on it. It's one of those books where you're going to get a lot of information and a lot of questions at the end. But I think that no one seems to have the tools to navigate this conversation dialogically. And what that means is people come in not in a dialogical mode in trying to lean into one another's pain, collective narrative, suffering. People are more content to throw truth grenades and walk away. So it's hard to build community in a polarized setting. I think that the war has changed Jewish communities, at least the ones that I work with, in ways that they'll never return. Before October 7th, there was already a movement within even conservative Jewish communities in Baltimore to accept that the democratic project in Israel was possibly not democratic. And there was an openness to engage in the type of debate that you imagine having in Jewish communities. Those debates are not happening with the same type of urgency, obviously. So the question is whether or not we return to them with the insight that we had going in before October 7th. But as I said before, there is this generational divide on the symbolic importance of Israel. Most younger Jews only know Israel in the context of being an occupying power. They only know it in the context of the violence that has taken place in both Gaza and the West Bank. They don't know the 73 war. They don't know the 67 war. This isn't something they've lived through. Whereas the older people that I work with, informs their identity. Developing a language that can cut through that experiential tension, I think, is going to be the work of Jewish leaders. Because, as you were saying earlier, you have a lot of young, politically minded Jewish professionals going into the clergy who are going to have to lead congregations that don't see eye to eye on their politics. Mm-hmm. And one of the hardest things about community is keeping people coming and not alienating them while still trying to serve a prophetic voice in those places. So I think that will be one of the major things moving forward for American Jewish communities.
I think that one of the things that I have tracked in my research on American Jewish education, and specifically summer camps and youth movements, is the growth of a kind of Israel-centered education that started to take place all the way back actually in the 1950s, but really took off in the 60s and 70s, using Israel as basically an identity building tool for American Jewish young people. And then I guess it's almost been about 10 years ago that, if not now, maybe a little bit less than 10 years ago, what is time? If not now, launched a campaign called #YouNeverToldMe. And that was basically sort of showing different American Jewish young people's experiences in Jewish institutions and in day schools, summer camps, youth groups, and that they were saying, then I got to college and I realized you never told me all of these things about Israel and the Palestinians. So there's this, growing, like I said before, growing dissent over Israel that in some ways has been channeled among some young American Jews into more of an embrace of diaspora Jewish culture, whether that's Yiddish or Ladino or something else, or a return actually to interest in Jewish study. So you see the growth of radical queer yeshivas like Svara, and that is a place where young Jews are going to get an identity that's not based around Israel. At the same time, I'll just give a little anecdote. So I do study the American Jewish left, which is mostly, looking at younger Jews. And I'm also, I'm not that young anymore. I'm 35 and pregnant, but I'm still in touch with that world. And there's, something interesting going on in my community that I think is really indicative of where things are going and the dangers of where things could go. So in my community, there's a lot of different egalitarian but traditional and non-affiliated minyanim, different prayer communities. And after October 7th, a lot of people pressured those communities to have some sort of statement, or at the very least to make a decision. Were they going to say the prayer for the hostages? Were they going to say some sort of prayer for Palestinians in Gaza? How were they going to show up ritually for the moment? Were they going to continue to say the prayer for the state of Israel? That's another flashpoint. And that what resulted from that was the minyan I'm mainly a part of doing something that kind of towed a very careful line. Anti-Zionists left the minyan and created an anti-Zionist minyan, and Zionists who didn't like the line that my minyan towed created a separate minyan that's a Zionist minyan. So I think that when I think about Trumpism and like what all of these years have given us, it's that people don't want to talk to each other across political divides anymore. And I think that this move of dividing Jewish communities based on Israel politics it's understandable in some ways because anti-Zionist Jews have felt so left out by American Jewish institutions. They have not been accepted by synagogues. So I can understand the reaction of wanting to have a space where they can be anti-Zionist Jews. But I think this is really worrisome, the idea that Jewish communities should be divided, that you shouldn't pray next to or eat meals next to people who might have a different view on Israel than you. So that's something that I'm watching with a lot of fear. And I don't know where it's going to go, but I'm hoping after things maybe cool down at some point, people will be able to come back together and create a new vision of how to go forward and not let Israel become something that divides us to that degree. That is to me a new degree to create an anti-Zionist minyan, a Zionist minyan. I don't know. I think it's really upsetting.
Is your minyan the mechitza then?
No mechitza. No,
I mean.
Is it the mechitza?
People who didn't go one way or the other.
In some ways, yeah, right. In my minyan, we have anti-Zionists still, and we have Zionists. We have Israelis. My husband's Israeli, who's a left-wing Zionist, right? We have a lot of nuance. But there are enough people in the community now to split off also into those various groups. It's a little sad. So.
More to say there, but Bruce, finish us off with this round.
Okay, well, I'm going to try to connect a couple of things people have mentioned. For me, I think thinking about how American Jewish identity will be transformed in the coming future, I think is going to be a major conversation. When you look at the historians and social scientists who've tried to define Jewish identity, they've often defined it using the Holocaust, using Israel, and using Yiddishkeit as the core cornerstones. Apparently, only Yiddishkeit is growing, right? So the debates over the
In our
Holocaust.
tiny circles all the time.
Right. And so that alone suggests there's going to be a transformative process across the next generation. But in addition to that, if you look at Pew surveys or Brandeis surveys, you'll see that increasing numbers of non-Ashkenazi, non-white Jews are being classified or categorized or self-identifying themselves as such. So for instance, on my campus at UC Davis, the Hillel was quite surprised when they did a survey of Jewish students that 17% of the Jewish students came back and said they were non-white. And if you look at the Hillel, you would not know where they were. And so that's going to be one of the institutional challenges, is how they will bring those students into the institutional fold. But also, again, back to this race thing. I know I keep going back to this race thing. But when Ben talks about immigration and the way in which Jews are framed as the organizers of the downfall of Western culture and society, that downfall has to do with bringing non-white people to America. And, you know, the closeness by which, I'm trying how to frame this. I don't think we can explain space lasers and conversations about Jews without turning to Nazi Germany and race. And I think we have been struggling to avoid linking these conversations. I think that is the test of our time, because it relates to Donald Trump, it relates to nationalist movements in a way in which race is framed as the basis for citizenship. And those issues are also facing Israel as Israel shifts to the right. So I do think that linking the way in which nationalism has embraced race and the way in which those forces play out here in the United States, I think is very important. And I think the way in which conversations about are Jews white, where the Jews fit into the multicultural space or to the DEI space, all revolve around the question of whiteness and race. And I don't think it can be avoided any longer. I think this is going to be the conversation of the future in a way. It will be the only way, I think, American Jewry will keep itself together, precisely because of these fascinating changing demographics that we're observing.
All right, well, it's about time to turn things over to the audience, and I also want to invite you guys to speak amongst yourselves, maybe as the audience frames some questions. Maybe we'll begin by taking 2 or 3 questions together and then allow you to just jump in. I will note, I mean, just a couple things that I think are incredibly illuminating comments, and they work so beautifully together. I mean, one thing that still, I think is still hanging over, so maybe I'm asking the first question, I'll turn to the audience. Oh yeah, the mic, sorry. In short, you know, lots of things have changed, and yet, as you pointed out, Sandy, some time ago, the Jewish voting patterns haven't changed, but that's a stick with 2 points, right? So 20% of Jews consistently vote for Republicans, and 20% of Jews are Orthodox in the US, and it's pretty much the same bunch of people. So there's a substantial part of the community that doesn't seem to be reorienting around these kinds of questions, and in fact I think would sharply reject many of the terms and accounts that we've been giving here, and that suggests to me that there is a kind of way in which American Jewish life remains not simply bifurcated, but sharply bifurcated in ways that that I'd like to hear more about. But so that's maybe a question I'll throw out to let linger. And what I want to do now is I want to turn to the audience. Maybe I'll take 2 questions for a first round. We'll have a discussion, and then we'll come back around to the well. So please, right there in the back, and please speak up.
Hi, my name is Gail Luxemburg. I should say I was a Jewish communal professional, headed the JCCs in Atlanta, and a lot of the things, I agree with everything that you're saying, our diverse communities. We've always been diverse, but it seems October 7th is a real inflection point in our communal history. And Israel for American Jews feelings about it, how much do we support it, it's a very complex relationship. But all of a sudden, it's okay to not support Israel. We've separated our politics of Israel from our religion. I had the same reaction as you. There's an anti-Zionist Seder in Evanston next week, and that's okay. So our complexity is now complexity around Israel. But it seems to me in some ways that October 7th really also unified us.
Thank you. Maybe we'll just start here and then, yeah, go ahead, please.
Well, what really comes to mind is I think of 1924 and immigration of Jews to America and how divided the Jewish community was between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And the rise of anti-Semitism to the 1930s as we entered World War II certainly galvanized the American Jewish community and brought those differences together. And so in many ways, 100 years later, you might say we're facing similar kinds of challenges that maybe are not so different from the past.
I think one thing that we're experiencing is the intensity of attention that people have on Jews and that Jews have on Israel, regardless of across the political spectrum. I think there's just an intensity of interest, of people watching the news, of people expressing their opinion, which I think could lead to a sort of a feeling of togetherness. We're all in this together, but I think could just as easily lead to intense fighting and maybe more fragmentation because more people are expressing their opinions, are paying attention to it, and have venues in which to express their disagreement. So I'm not feeling certain that the outcome, I think it will be both, and is both, both a feeling of sort of gathering around this collective trauma, and also a feeling of divisiveness, even within communities, within institutions, within families. Just sort of anecdotally, in my own home congregation, there's just a lot of conversation about, well, how do I talk to my son? How do I talk to my daughter? Because there's this feeling of generation gap within the same relatively small community. So is it a moment of sort of a feeling of togetherness? I'm not certain. It may be something different than that.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm not, at least I'm not personally experiencing it as a moment of unification. I think that the question of what is even anti-Semitism is at this point so fraught for people, right? So there have been anti-Semitic things that happen on campuses, and there also have been moments where college students feel threatened because there's pro-Palestinian activism, and they might call some of that anti-Semitism. So I think it's become very, very fraught, at least from my perspective studying younger Jews.
Yeah, now I'm feeling like the rain on the not adding more rain. I think that because our Jewish communities were unable to develop a language that included people who were wary of Israel, who had a Jewish identity outside of Israel, the anti-Zionists, the non-Zionists, the counter-Zionists, that institutionally they weren't welcome and marginalized, it sort of widened that cavern in terms of October 7th, because the voiceless in certain communities who are not taken as seriously become louder and are trying to find a Jewish identity outside of Israel. In terms of the rise of anti-Semitism, I want to throw this out there that it's not universally agreed that there is a rise in anti-Semitism. It's universally agreed that there's a rise in the reporting of anti-Semitism. I lived in Appalachia for almost 7 years, and nobody reported the anti-Semitism that I was reporting or taking very seriously, because it didn't have to do with Israel, if I'm speaking personally. So I think all of that frustration and And fear was exacerbated in the wake of October 7th. At least the Jewish communities that I work with in Baltimore are hardly unified. In fact, you have rabbis and congregations that are at odds with one another and feeling muzzled by what they can and cannot say. What that means in the future, I will say I remain sanguine in the sense that this isn't, while some of the things are new, Jews have been good historically at working out certain differences, even when, because I don't know that Jews have ever agreed on much.
Exactly.
Maybe it's time to just be funny for a second. I often would hear Jewish conspiracies when I lived in Appalachia, and I was bemused.
That is funny, Ben.
I was bemused that we can't even agree on what to eat, but you think that we can sit in a room together, work out all of these complicated economies, and we can agree on all of those things. But whether or not a tuna or a turkey and cheese is going to get me to the Olam Haba is, I'm sorry. Just because we've been so down, I wanted to throw a little bit of some whipped cream there.
Well, I think we probably should end on that note, but I do see another question in the very back, so please come on up. Yeah, but make it quick because we have 4 minutes. We don't want to cut into the time for the film and its presenter.
Okay, I have a short question. So continuing on the theme of the future, I've noticed a great resurgence in almost nostalgia for separateness. Separateness in Jewish communities, in older Jews and younger Jews. You see this in the rise of guys and growth of Yiddishkeit. They're like, we want to claim something that's our own. We want to be Jewish. How does this sort of nostalgia for almost like a glamorized Anatevka, how is that going to work out in the future of moving Judaism forward while everyone seems to be looking backwards to something greater?
Fantastic question.
Good question. We'll leave that to Ben.
I am not sure that it's a rise in something. I think that has been around for a long time. I'm thinking about the Jewish catalog in the 70s and this kind of idea of DIY Judaism, and it can be ours, and the kind of ethnic revival that comes after in the wake of the Black Panther movement and in the wake of various kinds of pride movements, right? That Jews looking for a way to express a feeling of pride through an idea of separateness and the beauty of that separateness. I don't think it's a new phenomenon. I do think that there are new expressions of that phenomenon, and this idea of an idealized Anatevka maybe has as much to do with forgetting as it has to do with reclamation, right? An idea that maybe there's less knowledge about that history. People are further removed from that history. They don't have living relatives who lived in any kind of real Eastern Europe or spoke Yiddish, and so it's maybe easier to idealize and try to reclaim some of that. But again, I don't think that's so new, right? Because if you're calling it a glamour Anatevka, even Anatevka itself was a glamour Anatevka when Fiddler on the Roof was new on Broadway, right? Yeah. So we're talking at least as long as I've been alive and longer that we've had these kinds of nostalgic community building.
I think this also relates to the kind of independent minyanim movement that I mentioned before. And I think that what always happens, and I think this happened in the 1960s and 70s with Jews who were inspired by ethnic revival and built the Chavurah movement, which is the same thing basically as this independent minyan movement. A lot of people in it don't know that there was this historical precedent, is that once they hit a certain marker of adulthood, let's say starting a family, then they have to face Jewish institutions again. right? They might need to go pick a school, a summer camp. They might end up needing to move to the suburbs because they need more space and leave these cities that have these little communities, and they need, and then they're interfacing with those institutions. I think the question is, will those institutions respond to this kind of, let's say, diasporist interest, this desire for separateness, for experiencing Jewish identity on different terms, maybe moving away from Israel as part of that, or will they not? And I think the story mostly has been that they have not, in the past, really responded super well to that. And we'll see what happens in the future. I mean, I'm personally, as a summer camp researcher, very interested in what happens at Jewish summer camps this summer, post-October 7th, right? As an example of, does Jewish education actually change as the American Jewish community changes, or is there still going to be kind of, at least from the perspective of education, pushing a nostalgic agenda about Israel rather than a realistic one?
Right. One thing that we didn't talk about, is in terms of demographic shift is the delay in the longer young adulthood, the older ages of especially people in kind of these more call them liberal communities, the later age of having children, because having children is a moment when people enter institutions, and that has to do with, among other things, the lack of support for childcare in America, right?
Right.
The way that people then, where can I find a community that will support me? And there's money in the Jewish community to support Jewish families going to Jewish preschool, for instance. And so I think those are moments that may explain some of the anxiety around continuity, because that's a moment when the Jewish community can kind of catch those families and sort of regularize, normalize, bring them into the community in its sort of more, its older institutions. And so maybe some of the shifts that we're seeing of delay in affiliation or lack of affiliation have to do with also some of these broader demographic trends.
I realize we also never talked about economics, but the fact that millennials are downwardly mobile from
Yeah.
their parents' generation has a lot to do with all of this.
Right. Synagogue dues are not affordable.
Can't
for
afford
a
to
lot
have
of people.
kids, can't, buy a
I just
house.
wanted to follow up on one point that Jessica made. Mark Dollinger makes a really good case for that rise in Jewish pride, and I'm sorry. Mark Dollinger has a book called, I think it's called Black Power, Jewish Politics. Mm-hmm. And in that book, he makes a good case for that rise in sort of Jewish pride and identity in the early 70s, to speak to that point.
And last word.
Let me say something and then have someone else have the last word, since I had it last time. I don't know that I can replicate whipped cream. So Franz Rosenzweig, I'm really excited to say that name, because this is the one place in the world I can say that name and no one needs to look at their phone. Franz Rosenzweig wrote a letter to his cousin Hans Ehrenberg that he was converting to Christianity. And the reason why he was converting to Christianity is because it made sense. The language we speak is Christian. The culture we live in is Christian. Everything we do based on the Christian culture, even saying I'm Jewish, is a form of Christianity. Because we're not separate. We are part of the German culture, the German nation, which is Christian. So why fight it? Jewish separateness should really be understood in terms of finding like a souvenir, right? You have a menorah on your bookshelf. You look at it and remember the good times it was being separately Jewish. So it was a different kind of nostalgia. What I think is important, and Franz Rosenzweig, as you know, did not convert and had an Erlebnis experience in which he became a Choser B'Tshuva. He became or an idiosyncratic Orthodox Jew. But why I think that's important is that while we talk about American culture as somehow implicitly or explicitly Christian in the language we use, in the ways that we define what religion is, Jews have been able to carve out and navigate their differences in productive ways that doesn't require an either-or conversion. And so For instance, the Yiddishisms that we've been talking about have made their way into non-Jewish voices. That what it would mean to assimilate into an American culture isn't fully Christian. It's like 85%. Which means that carving out something separate is not as it's not as urgent as you could tell. I'm the one person who's comfortable with continuity in terms of Jews and non-Jews imagining Judaism together.
Well, I think on that note, it remains to thank our panelists. There'll be time for a few questions and some coffee, and then and please don't leave because we're going to move on to the next part of our program. But please join me in thanking our panelists for this fascinating discussion.
It is my pleasure to introduce to you the star of the second part of the show, although she's probably glaring at me for calling her a star. Let me please introduce you to Naama Rokem, who is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature and Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations here at the University of Chicago. She's a scholar of modern Hebrew and German Jewish literature who's particularly interested in translation, self-translation, and language mixing. She's going to talk to you a bit, and then we're going to show you a film, and then we'll do some more talking. Just as a reminder, there is lunch after this, so please do feel free to come down to eat and continue the conversation. Please, Naama.
Thank you. Yeah, so we're going to shift modality and frame of reference and zoom in to a very particular, we've been thinking about during the fascinating panel that we all just listened to, kind of on a large scale about big existential questions and large trends and community with a kind of capital C. And what I will be sharing with you and talking a little bit about is something much more local here on the south side of Chicago, and but it's a project that tries to think through some of the larger questions that we were just thinking about through this one site. And this site is a cemetery that is called Oakwood Cemetery. It is an operating cemetery, right? It's still in use, and people can buy plots there or be buried in one of these sort of wall things where you can have space in. It is a historic cemetery, so it was founded in the 1850s. It's multi-denominational, and there are multiple Jewish sections, including historic ones that we'll see some footage of in a second. It's also connected to the history of the University of Chicago. William Rainey Harper, Mircea Eliade, since we're standing in the Divinity School, is buried there. Many kind of notable figures that have to do with that history. It also has one part of the cemetery. So most of the cemetery is run, like most cemeteries in the US today, by a corporation called Divinity, Inc. They run thousands of cemeteries all over the country. Some of it is unincorporated, is kind of historically, and you'll hear a little bit about that in the movie. There's part of it that is also federal land that is kind of associated with and run by the federal government, which is the so-called Confederate Mound. And this is the place where prisoners of war from Camp Douglas were buried in a mass grave after they were actually reinterred there. So they were first, soldiers of the Confederate Army who were prisoners of war in Camp Douglas in Chicago during the war, who died there by the thousands, who were all buried in one location in the city, and then after the Great Fire were reinterred in Oak Woods. And at the turn of the century, a group of kind of civic leaders in Chicago, for their own reasons, decided to commemorate that, to build a monument. So several decades after they were buried there, a monument was built that still stands there to this day, and is also part of that. So that's just in a few brief kind of sentences, the complexity and the interest of this place. It's a dense and sort of fascinating location that is literally a mile and a half south that way, straight, if you just walk 25 minutes. But we could have loaded you all on a bus and gone to look around there, but partly we didn't know what the weather would be, and it is an operating cemetery. It's a place where people still come to bury their dead and to mourn, so it's a complicated kind of the question of when and how one can visit, and the way that it functions also as a historic site, a site for people to visit and to learn from, is a little bit complicated. But this is all part of a project that has it's been growing and forming collaborations between the Department of Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity, which is a new academic department here on campus, the Divinity School, the Marty Center, the Greenberg Center for Jewish Studies, and other units. And the question is how to preserve, document, learn from, learn with, bring our students to this place, and many other questions. And I'm really excited, the brilliant solution that Emily proposed to the question of how to bring guests to this site is with the magic of audiovisual documentation. And as academics, we mostly we write articles, we write books, we teach. We don't often do things like this, so it's also this was something that my colleague Jessica Kirzane also, as you will see in a second, helped with a lot, and it's a new mode of communicating with the public for us, I would say. So we're also excited to get feedback on that. The movie is about, 9 minutes long? Something like that. So we'll just view it together. This is the world premiere of this short documentary that we produced about this place. And then there's time for a chat about it. I'm really curious to hear, but during which we'll be very disciplined about speaking to that. Maybe we'll bring it closer or something so that we can have a conversation about this.
What does it feel like to walk the distance from the entry gate all the way back to where the Jewish section is?
That there is this rich and largely untapped history that is documented. The Oakwoods, it dates back to the 1850s. So if you can imagine, this is the south side of Chicago before it's an urban area, before it's part of the city even. It's a moment in kind of the history of American cemeteries in which this kind of movement of the lawn cemeteries is on the ascendance and in vogue. So there's an architect called Adolf Staub, and he is hired to design Oakwoods as a lawn cemetery, as a park. So that's sort of how it becomes this beautiful natural environment, or kind of built natural environment, right, with ponds and trees and landscaping as a central feature of that makes it into a kind of green space as well as a cemetery that serves the community.
The first Jewish part of it is outside of the official Oakwood Cemetery boundaries, but directly adjacent to it. It's like right along 71st Street, and that belonged to the Ohav Shalom Mariupol congregation beginning in 1874. So pretty shortly after the Oakwood Cemetery itself was established, this pretty small congregation in Chicago established their own Jewish cemetery, and it couldn't be owned by Oakwood Cemetery because it had to be owned by Jews. And so they just put it right next to the existing cemetery. So this congregation, Ohav Shalom Mariupol, was located in what was the Maxwell Street neighborhood in Chicago. Not everyone who was buried there was from the town of Mariupol, which is in Lithuania, but it was part of the congregation grew out of a Landsmannschaft, an organization of people who were all from the same town, and then it kind of grew from there to people who joined who were from Chicago proper, and that's why it has that name. We don't know a lot about the people who are buried in that part, and it really speaks to, I think, the way that a lot of history is just unrecoverable. The stones themselves are deteriorating. It's kind of hard even to read what's there. There aren't good records of who is buried there.
Communities that existed on the South Side and South Shore and Woodlawn and Hyde Park as Jewish communities in Chicago, but then sort of as the city transforms and the lives of Jews in the cities change, these communities move away. They move west, north, to the northern suburbs, ultimately. And these kinds of spaces, like the cemetery, like the synagogues, are left behind.
But there's something about a cemetery and its permanence that forces everyone to kind of come back to the beginning, to this early settlement, and this idea of like having a kind of rootedness in Chicago, which I think is something that we don't often think about for the Jewish community because they are largely an immigrant communities.
It has this kind of immutability, and that's one of the things that interests me a lot about a space like the Jewish Cemetery in Oak Woods, how it functions as a kind of remnant or documentation, a trace that we can learn from.
In 1956, something really interesting happens, and which is that they erect a monument there to the people who died, who perished in World War II, which included U.S. veterans and also victims of the Holocaust. It's a cemetery with a lot of monuments, and there's a way in which the Jewish community putting a monument there is sort of integrating itself into the fabric of the rest of the cemetery.
The Holocaust Monument is one of the earliest Holocaust memorials or monuments that was built in the United States or indeed anywhere. It comes relatively early in the sort of the history of memorialization of the Holocaust.
The monument itself, it's made up of 6 red granite shafts that go 20 feet in the air, and they form a Star of David on the dome that has little solar panels, which must have been pretty exciting new technology at that point, and that's why it's called the Eternal Light Monument. And Eternal Light is something that you would find in a synagogue to symbolize the eternality of God. And so this is taking that symbology of the synagogue with the eternal light over the Torah scrolls and putting that in a cemetery.
The plaque that's in the middle of this monument has 2 different texts on it. The English says, in memory of the more than 6 million Jewish martyrs of World War II. And every choice here is interesting, right? They're described as martyrs, and they are martyrs of World War II. This is before the term Holocaust was in wide circulation, and they didn't use it. The Hebrew says something quite different. It says, Lezecher achenu bnei Israel shemasru nafsham al kiddush Hashem. These are formulaic sort of expressions. This is kind of language that they're using from a given context. It's language that comes from a long history of speaking about Jewish victims of communal violence. And it says, in memory of our brothers, the people of Israel, who gave their souls for the sanctification of the Lord. May God avenge their blood. So unlike the English, first of all, where the English says martyrs, the Hebrew here specifies that these are people who gave their souls to sanctify God. And it also mentions the notion of revenge, which does not appear in the English at all.
You can go, you can read the name of someone on a gravestone, and then you're like, oh, I wonder who this person was and what they did. Let me just Google it. But of course you can't find it. It really brings home how much gets lost over time, as well as how much remains.
That this is sort of a cultural treasure that exists on the South Side, but it's just an incredibly valuable teaching tool to kind of raise questions for students about the history of the South Side, the different communities that have moved through this place, the legacies of that long history and how they form our existence in this space today.
When we go to cemeteries, generally speaking, we go there for personal reasons, right? And we have strong personal associations. We think about the people who have gone before us. We think about times we've buried someone. And I think it can be very hard to pull yourself back from the personal and also think about history and think about it in kind of like broad sweeping terms. And so I think we under-examine cemeteries because they're hard to look at, because they remind us about personal loss or about our own mortality. I'm hoping that this project will help us kind of take ourselves out of ourselves a little bit so that we can think about this grand sweep of history and all the different people who have lived it.
should mention, as the slide in the end says, that this project has received support now from the Women's Board at the University of Chicago, as well as actually the National Endowment for Humanities and the Mellon Foundation have also given grants. But it's very much still, this is kind of the earliest real fruit of it. But other exciting things that have been going on recently is that we have two colleagues in the history department who regularly teach a kind of public history course, a kind of course and a practicum on public history. This year it was taught by Leora Auslander and Adam Green in history and race, diaspora, and indigeneity, and they've actually they're finishing up kind of a 2-quarter sequence in which a group of about 20 students did various projects that all connect with different parts of the cemetery, not necessarily the Jewish history, but as I meant, the Confederate mound, the religious history in the cemetery more broadly, and other aspects of kind of asking questions about the way that this site also exists within the urban sort of environment that it is in, kind of on the border between Grant Crossing and Woodlawn. At present, there's a group that's thinking about it as a green space precisely, and trying to think about it's the way that it interacts as a kind of part of the environment, both in terms of the chemicals that are in the ground, but also in that it's one of the largest green spaces for many blocks around it. So there are a lot of really, really interesting questions to approach it, or directions to approach it from. One thing I just learned is that there is a longer history of teaching with this site, and people who've brought Hebrew school classes and synagogue groups, I guess, to younger learners to this space to think about the memorialization of the dead and practices around burial in Jewish communities. And the speaker also mentioned the fact that until fairly recently, it was quite hard to even enter the space because it had not been landscaped at all. It was in pretty bad shape. And there have been, this is not our doing at all, but I think there have been moments in which it's received sort of some media attention, kind of people have noticed that people are coming to visit, and there's now sort of a sponsorship from someone, a private, there are signs that say who it is, and I'm not exactly sure off the top of my head, but there are people who have, in collaboration with Divinity Inc., who runs, they have their own kind of landscaping operation to run the cemetery, and I think they've done some even like lifting of gravestones and kind of clearing of the space, and that's very interesting. But the question of how one would even start to catalog everyone that is buried there and to learn more about them. You know, there are genealogical societies that do really kind of interesting work, are very active, the Jewish Genealogical Society of Illinois and other groups, other kind of genealogical societies for other groups that are in the cemetery. But it's not a straightforward, it's not, I mean, I think that's one of the things for me when I started thinking about how we would use this space as a teaching tool, the fact that, as Jessica also sort of says in the movie, that one of the experiences of walking through a historic cemetery is this constant, every name and every data point is a kind of riddle. Who was this person? You start calculating the ages, right? Because we're confronted with all these numbers. You see markers that just say baby. That's kind of something to think about. How did that come about? What did it mean to the person who put it there? So it's in the most immediate sense a kind of a space to share with students just the way that questions open up to more questions and potential research. Once you kind of beyond the who is this person, there's the kind of how are all these people connected? How is this part of the cemetery connected to other parts? How did they choose? I mean, I don't know if anyone noticed the photographs on these graves that are a feature of this particular historic cemetery. Are just endless, and they're quite uniform. So there are these portraits that are all kind of oval on a kind of metal. They seem to have all been produced in the same place, and they are also very kind of moving, thought-provoking invitations to imagine the people who are buried there. But I think there's also a lot to learn about how that practice came about, how these things were marketed, how they were, how people chose the portraits that are on them. There's so many kind of questions to ask about that. Yes, please. Yes, please do.
So I would encourage you to explore some of the other parts of the cemetery and talk about the stories and the connections and the pluralism of the Jewish community that was mentioned during the panel discussion. So there's a section of Oakwood which Congregation Road Tzedek has, where we will be. And there was a story, just a kind of an interesting story that occurred very recently, where one of the beloved members of our community, distinguished professor and physician at the University of Chicago Hospitals, he drowned trying to save a young person in Michigan. And we arranged to gift the family a burial plot within the road face section of the cemetery. He was a Jew by choice and of Chinese descent, going back to the pluralism and demographic changes. But his mother wanted to be buried next to him. The charter of the Road Face Tzedek Cemetery does not allow non-Jews to be buried in that section. But there is a section that's just a little bit beyond where the Road Face the section is, where you can have Jews and non-Jews buried. And so if you go just a little bit further from the Holocaust Memorial that you see there, you'll see his marker and the space reserved for his mother. And it has this kind of Asian, Chinese symbolism to the stone. So there are a lot of stories like this within that community, and I would encourage you to continue this exploration project.
Thank you. Yes, please.
I would just add that I just wanted to add there's even styles and stylistic periods among markers, and the pictures. The markers with pictures are from a particular era, probably the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. That was dropped. One of the beautiful things about this old section is the markers themselves are incredibly complex. They have line upon line upon line upon line of Hebrew, extolling the person who's died. So it also implies either the willingness to spend money on that kind of gravestone. I mean, I think there's sort of socioeconomic history that one can also deduce from the markers. So I encourage everyone to go. It's really interesting.
And very close by. Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you. That was excellent. I would love to hear you think out loud a little bit more about the Holocaust Memorial, both about its bilingualism and about the kind of language choices that are made in what's available to what parts of the community, and maybe, I don't know if this is something you thought about either, but like how this relates to something like the so-called myth of silence, right, to American Jews, to the Holocaust in the 50s and 60s as they're thinking about their own history. Just an absolutely fascinating piece, and I would just love to hear more from you about it.
Yeah, and I mean, Jessica can say a lot more because I think she's also done more research about this particular site and has more of a sense of I mean, I can say that, connecting kind of the previous comment, right, the fact that the historic Jewish cemetery has a lot of Hebrew text in it, and long kind of, also sort of coming from a long tradition of sort of formulaic expressions that belong in that space, and in that, it's a kind of genre, right, of tombstone poetry, as it were. And there's a lot of it there, and some of it really striking and very, very interesting in itself and worth kind of preserving and learning about. And then you have kind of often markers that have both Hebrew and English, markers that mention the town in Eastern Europe that people have come from also. So the kind of, and even a little bit of Yiddish in some places on some of the tombstones. So there's a kind of echo. In that sense, there's a continuity. The fact that this plaque is bilingual, and that's where my identity as a scholar of comparative literature, I immediately compare and think about kind of how the translation is never straightforward and never without important choices being made. So that was what I was trying to highlight there. But yeah, I also found it kind of, that was one of the first things I noticed when I first visited this site, and I found it, the design of it, just the fact that it exists, the fact that it's from so early, all of it very, very interesting. And if I understand correctly, and I'll let Jessica say more, but it was a communal effort, right? And that's part of what, it was something that the community did as a community, as part of its sort of self-understanding also as a community in the mid-50s on the south side of Chicago.
I don't have so much more to add, but I'll add a few more things with regard to this question about this myth of silence. You may have heard of Hasia Diner's book, We Remember with Reverence and Love, and in it she talks about a memorial to the Warsaw Ghetto uprising that's in Manhattan, in Riverside Park, and it's a kind of small, modest memorial that was one of the earliest ones. And I think we can kind of see the way that Holocaust remembrance was happening even in the moment of the Holocaust, but it moved to different spaces and it looked different and the language around it was different. One place where it did happen was internally in the Jewish community. It was happening in synagogues. It was happening in a Jewish cemetery in a way that wouldn't have been happening in sort of a more broader American public sphere. So that's kind of part of the history of like where the Holocaust can be found, how we think about the Holocaust. It makes sense in this moment in 1956 for this to be happening in a Jewish part of a cemetery as opposed to in, say, a national museum or a monument that would be a more sort of open-ended thing. The actual installation of the monument itself was a communal effort and was a major ceremony. So Max Janowski, who was the cantor at KAM and was a major composer, he wrote music. There were choirs composed of synagogue choirs from multiple denominations and multiple congregations throughout the city who came together and performed music by Max Janowski at the installation of this monument. And so it was a big production, and it was a way of, I think, communally marking this place. And then you can find in newspapers other times when Jewish war veterans came and gathered there, and different kinds of memorials that happened around it. And so even though the object is a fixed one, what happens when various communities go and gather there is a more kind of fluid history that I think we could look at as well.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And to expand on that and on a point that you made in the clip that we showed, that that what you just said could be applied also, for example, to the Confederate mound, right? Mm-hmm. It's a fixed monument. It's a physical marker that was put in place at a certain moment to promote certain ideas and to kind of frame a certain story. And then people grapple with it and return to it and think about it in different ways, but it continues to exist there. And the other sort of the fact that that's just one of a whole range of, and every time I go visit, I learn about more. But there are, in addition to the Confederate mound, there is a statue of Lincoln there in the cemetery that is part of a Union memorial. There's right next to the Confederate mound, there's actually a kind of cenotaph, I don't know how to pronounce this in English, but that is a kind of counter monument that was erected by an anonymous abolitionist from the South. So it was put kind of right next to the Confederate mound with a text that kind of answers and responds and more or less around the same time that the Confederate Mound was built, as a sort of protest against it. There is a monument that documents the visit of a Baha'i leader to the cemetery in the early 20th century, occasion in which he blessed everyone who was buried in the cemetery. So the kind of the intersection also of religion, memorialization, public memorialization, community is very dense in this site in a way that, and in a way that I think the Jewish leaders who put it is a communal space and a kind of internal Jewish communal space within which the marker was put, and yet it's also an interdenominational space in which this marker kind of is in conversation with other monuments around it, which is also part of the dynamic.
Something that I'm not sure, and maybe you'll know better than I do, but my sense is that the section of the cemetery in which the Holocaust Memorial is located, the Rotfeisedek section, is not much older than the monument itself. That cemetery, that area of the cemetery might have been purchased by the congregation around that time. Maybe you know better. The reason why I know it is because when I look in historical newspapers, that's when they start advertising that there are plots available, is right around 1956. So it may be that the congregation, and maybe you know, purchased the land, they're starting to bury people there, and then they want to make this space recognizable as a Jewish space in the cemetery, and with a similar kind of structure, memorialization structure, as all the other spaces. So other spaces have statues. We should have some kind of monument. What would be an appropriate one for the Jewish space? And this is, right after, the post-war period, so it's a Holocaust memorial. And so in that way, it makes the space visibly recognizable when it's relatively new and there aren't that many graves there yet.
Assertively in our interview that you saw that this was that 1956 was before it would have been in very wide circulation as a term, and that it's not surprising that the plaque says refers to the martyrs of World War II, which is not a term a phrase that we would use today. But then the question was asked when the term Holocaust does start to be used more widely, and
yeah, I don't actually know the answer to that question, but I do think it's related to the Human Rights Convention as well. So I'm not sure, and I think it kind of catches on sort of gradually as well. So it was among the various options. The Nazi aggression was another one that people used quite a lot, and so. But I think my feeling is it's in the 60s that it kind of comes into play, but there are people who know that much better than I do, and I would suggest Hasia Diner's book, We Remember with Reverence and Love, as a good place to look for that.
Yes.
Since everybody's quiet. So, given that I'm in America's most historically segregated city, right? What was profound for me is thinking about the ability of the Ashkenazi community to control their burial space and to also have the resources to create such monuments. And so it's an interesting juxtaposition to the black community, and it'd be interesting to see what one would find if you did actually a comparison. And it goes back to the question of Jewish whiteness in a society where race matters.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's like an open research question for the whole project, both kind of the question of kind of what kinds of comparisons it enables, but even just how to understand the space itself, the degrees to which it is and isn't segregated and divided off. So people have been burying their dead there since the 1850s, and as I said, the kind of the question of access to it is uneven. There are moments in which it's run by people who simply discriminate by race, period. But it also continues. I mean, to this day, it's it takes a communal effort sometimes, even just to buy a plot there. It's not cheap, and it's perceived when you talk to people kind of around in the community, I've heard several times the first response is like, oh yeah, that's that's not accessible to everyone. And there are other cemeteries in the suburbs that are cheaper, right? So there's a kind of dynamic that has to do with kind of access, and again, who is this for? And that's been a question for this whole project, is also kind of who should have access to it, to learn from it, to think with it, right? We bring our students there, but who else do we want to bring in and be in conversation with about what this space means? So there are kind of, I know that, say, Harold Washington's birthday, I believe, is an event that is marked there as a kind of communal event. And I recently learned that at the time that he died in 1980 something, quite suddenly, right, died while he was in office, he was buried in Oakwoods, but only a certain number of people were allowed in. And the wall was already up, but that there are videos kind of from a helicopter that were on the news at the time showing kind of thousands of people. This was like a unprecedentedly large gathering just of people all around mourning, kind of participating in the burial from the outside on all sides of the cemetery. So I think, yeah, the thing that has been striking to me is that it just, everywhere you touch in this space, it just kind of, there's so many interesting stories. And precisely this dynamic that Jessica spoke about as well in the film, that a kind of reluctance, it's a weird object or not the most comfortable, right? Especially as a cemetery that's still operating. People have kind of different relationships to it, but I find that very interesting as well, as a question of kind of how to use this thing to think together, to teach, to document, and so on. This is some of the work that the project is, even though we've been raising funds for it and thinking about it for a while, but it's still quite nascent in other ways. We haven't done, I mean, I think the first part of the work would be precisely these kind of straightforward genealogical, finding birth records and death records and all of that. Much of that does exist and could be located. And then the question of whether and how. I had one conversation, so one part of the cemetery is connected to, it's called Anshe Shalom on the north in Lakeview. There's a community called Anshe Shalom, and during the pandemic on Zoom, I had a really nice conversation with someone involved in that congregation, and he told me, we know that we have a connection to this, but I don't have a single congregant who has ancestors in that. So the turnover has also been such. So this is also an interesting reality of, say, urban, modern religious congregations is there's not that kind of stability. We don't belong. I can tell you, I don't know, beyond my grandparents, I don't know where anyone in my family is buried, right? For many reasons, probably. But so our sense also of the kind of I think cemeteries, in fact, are less stable than we tend to think. In Germany, for example, if you don't pay your fees after, I think it's 75 years, they will reuse your grave and bury someone else there. So there's also kind of this, we don't tend to go back that much, actually. And, no judgment.
No, I was just going to say, just to give credit to, I do think that there was some work by the Chicago Jewish Historical Society to do some categorizing of the older part of the cemetery. I don't know how far that project got or where those records are, although we should find out. But this is all sort of the beginnings of this project, but it opens itself up also to a lot of collaboration with community partners who hopefully will have more knowledge.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm glad I had this opportunity to share.
Part of the idea of doing this session this way was precisely for this sort of conversation, things that can help the project grow. So it's a really cool opportunity to have everyone together asking questions and thinking. So thank you so much for your feedback and ideas. Just a couple of notes, and then we will set you free for lunch. One is that as part of this project, we are actually engaged in the Marty Center is engaged in a decade-long oral histories project in which we are documenting the stories of religious Americans, or maybe we should say Americans who have a relationship to religion. You don't necessarily have to think about yourself as religious. And we have begun by documenting first the oral histories of Jewish Americans. So if you are someone who might like to give your oral history or would like to know more, you can email martycenter.org. Well, I forgot what our email address is. You can go to martycenter.org and find our email address. No one who actually knows these things is in this room with me right now. And you can also visit our website or sign up for our newsletter and find out more. But the goal is that within this decade, we hope to document the stories of American religiosity in Americans' own words. And so we're very grateful to have people signed up to talk about what it means to them to be Jewish in the US. And then we will proceed with other traditions and themes and questions. So you are all welcome if you would like to become part of an archive about what it means to be a religious American. And you can also, don't forget, I'm supposed to guilt trip you. You can fill out that card as another way to do that. Thank you again for joining us. Please do come downstairs for a kosher lunch. Yes? Thank you for your Googling powers. Marty Center at uchicago.edu. That is very straightforward. And you can find us there or on our website. Thank you all again for coming. There is a kosher lunch downstairs, and you have a little extra time if you would like, again, to visit the Kohelet exhibition, which you can see on floors 1, 2, and 3. It begins in the lobby. Thank you, and have a lovely day.